Let me welcome you here. I'm Perry Brown. I'm the Provost of the university. And this Provost Distinguished Lecture Series, we try to offer 3 or 4 lectures every fall of faculty members at the University of Montana. And the people that are selected for these lectures are people that have won either national or international awards, but we like to have them have the opportunity to share their knowledge and the things that they've been doing with people locally. Because you win a national award and a bunch of other people know all about you, but you don't get a chance to share with your colleagues, some of your students, your friends, these things. And so we like to do that. And so we have this lecture tonight. We had one about a month ago. And then on November 19th, Kelly Dixon from anthropology will be on the podium. And on December 3rd, Ray Fanning from journalism. And I would encourage any of you to come and hear them as well on some of the exciting things that they've been doing. But I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to ask Chris Comer, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to come forward and introduce our speaker to all of you. So, Chris, it's yours.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to see you all here. And I want to just say a few words about Jody's background and then sort of introduce the topic, but very briefly so I don't steal any of her thunder. Jody's also a good friend, somebody I've come to admire in the community. So I know a lot of people here are also her friends. I think this will be a very congenial talk. Jody joined the faculty of the College of Arts and Sciences in 2004, and she's currently an associate professor in the Department of History. If you look at her background, she's got an admirably interdisciplinary training. Her bachelor's degree is from Harvard University, and it's in Latin American Studies. She then moved to Florida International University, where she did a degree in international studies, and her PhD is in history from Duke University. Throughout her training, if you look at her record, she's gotten numerous awards and fellowships and scholarships to help her pursue her studies, and a lot of that has culminated in her recent book that she's going to talk about tonight. It was called Mining for the Nation, The Politics of Chile's Coal Communities from the Popular Front to the Cold War, Penn State University Press. And I've gone and read some of the reviews of this, and they're actually quite wonderful. It's won 2 different awards from major scholarly organizations. And a thing that's notable about it, and what she's going to say tonight, is, we often look for our own scholars to be doing work of local importance which might have a global resonance. This is a case where she's going to talk about something of global importance which is going to have a local resonance, because she's going to talk about the mining industry and how politics of a very complicated sort came together to impact what happened to the mining industry and their position in Chilean society in the period just before and just after World War II. It's a fascinating story, something I'm eager to hear more about. So, Jody, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Provost Brown, for inviting me. This really is a great honor for me. And thank you, Dean Comer, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming out, especially my colleagues in the history department who facilitate my work in so many ways. As Dean Comer said, the talk that I'm going to give today, most of it comes from my book. Here's the cover of it. Sorry, one sec. There it is. Mining for the Nation. The research that I did for this book was done over about a 5-year period that I lived in Chile from 1996 to 2001. What I ultimately found in this long study of mid-20th century Chile, and here, just to warn you, is the most theoretical and probably the most provocative part of my talk today. What I found was a powerful, nuanced, and to me quite surprising movement of working class men and women pushing in the case of the coal miners, almost literally from underground, to expand their place as citizen workers within the nation. And by citizen workers, I mean individual members of a democratic polity who also maintained a sense of collective class identity and material rights. The hegemonic notion developed in the West since the advent of the Cold War that individual personal liberty, freedom, is synonymous with democracy, and that the assertion of collective rights or the insistence on a just social safety net was somehow socialist, is somehow socialist in a very pejorative sense, was not the way leftists and centrists conceived of democracy in the mid-20th century. In other words, what I came to see was that the mid-20th century represented a conjuncture with the US-Soviet alliance, among other factors, when different actors and groups across the world shared notions of democracy, or at least the possibilities for democracy, not in narrow liberal terms of individual personal freedom and the unfettered movement of capital, but in collective terms, as a contestatory arena for pursuing socioeconomic justice and the well-being of society conceived as a whole. That I found such notions of democracy being discussed and actually lived out in many ways in the coal mining region was all the more interesting or even paradoxical to me, given the miners' strong connections to the Chilean Communist Party and the party's strong connections to Moscow, then of course under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. By the time I finished crafting the book, I realized that this vision of radical vision of democracy's potential was shared by diverse actors across the Americas in these years. Not only was the communist mayor of the coal mining town of Lota insisting that city council sessions be open to the public for the first time in the town's history, but also U.S. Vice President Henry Wallace, on a goodwill tour through Latin America, traveled to the coal mining towns, traveled to Lota, where he spoke in Spanish to nearly 10,000 residents and called the Chilean coal miners soldiers of democracy. Henry Wallace and the communist-led coal miners of Chile indeed seemed to share a vision of democracy which placed at its core the collective rights of the common man, to use Wallace's famous phrase. I'll talk a bit more about Wallace and his Latin American connections in a few minutes, which is the seed of my new research project. But first, let me tell you the story of this coal mining region that I keep referring to. Here's a map showing the location of the region, which is just about 30 kilometers south of Concepcion here, the third largest city in Chile. And here is a map of the region from 1924, showing in more detail the dozens of coastal and inland towns, fishing villages, agricultural properties, and rail lines, all tied in various ways to the extraction and distribution of coal, or to the sustenance of the workers doing the extraction and distribution. In 1940, the regional population was estimated at about 140,000 people, of whom about 16,000 or 11% were directly employed by one of several private coal mining companies. And unlike the case of Chilean copper mines, these companies were exclusively owned by domestic capital. The heart of this area, which became famous in Chile as La Zona Carbonifera, the coal mining zone, are these adjacent towns, coastal towns of Lota and Coronel, which are separated by a several kilometer stretch of beach, known as Playa Negra and Playa Blanca for the different colors of the sand. It was kind of strange for me the first time I saw coal miners leave work to go sit under beach umbrellas. In my research, I drew from a variety of methods and sources, reading not only traditional archival documents, but also popular media and pamphlets, folklore and fiction accounts, published and unpublished testimonials, and musical and artistic renditions. I also conducted dozens of interviews throughout the Chilean coal mining communities, where I lived with local families for extended periods of time. And here you see on top a picture of the communist president of the coal miners union, of the Lota Coal Miners Union, in 1972, having been called to Santiago to meet with then national president, socialist Salvador Allende, and below is Don Omar in his relatively modest home in the coal mining town of Lota, telling me about the experience as we looked on at the photo. In trying to reconstruct the history of the Chilean coal mining region in the 1930s and 40s and its significance for the history of democracy and social justice in the Western Hemisphere more broadly, I paid close attention to individuals and their particular life stories. Yet I tried to understand these individuals in relation to broader community, regional, national, and global dynamics. So now what I want to do here for the next few minutes is try to show you a little bit of the contours of this democratizing project that I found underway in the Chilean coal mining region, and unfortunately also its brutal suppression at the start of the Cold War. I will begin by reading a selection from Canto General, published in 1950 by Chile's Nobel Prize-winning poet Pablo Neruda. This selection is called The Massacres. From north to south, where the dead were ground or burned, they were buried in darkness or burned at night in silence, heaped in mine shafts, or their bones spit into the sea. Nobody knows where they are now. They have no grave. Their martyred fingers are dispersed in the country's roots. Their executed hearts, the Chileans smile, the Pampas valiant, the captains of silence. Nobody knows where the assassins buried these bodies, but they'll rise from the earth to redeem the fallen blood in the resurrection of the people. As I said, this is poet Pablo Neruda denouncing state violence, heralding the ghosts of the dead whose bodies have not been found. He is writing of miners and their families, campesinos, Mapuches, Chileans across the country, who were arrested in droves and sent to concentration camps, or as they called them, such as the northern nitrate town of Pisagua. Pisagua and other such camps would gain international notoriety as the places where thousands of Chileans disappeared during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, when the Popular Unity Project, led by Salvador Allende, exploded, both literally and figuratively, into flames. Yet it is not to these massacres of the 1970s and 80s that Neruda refers to in this poem. Rather, he wrote these lines about bodies with no graves in the late 1940s, at the very outset of the Cold War. At this time, it was a center-left political alliance known as the Popular Front that exploded into a frenzy of anti-communist persecution. This was a moment when Chile was at the height of a long history of presumably peaceful democracy prior to Pinochet's coup against Allende in September 1973. And yet the eruptions of violent conflict in this early period of the national development model, the 1940s, contain all of the embers that would re-spark in the 1970s. In this segment of Canto General, Neruda blends an account of a January 1946 police slaying of 6 workers at a rally in Santiago with the subsequent attack on tens of thousands of communists and working-class families, which began in October 1947, when the Chilean government moved to violently repress a workers' strike in the coal mining region. One of the most remarkable things about the 1947 strike was that the labor ministry itself had declared it to be a legal strike. And this was not an easy feat in Chile at the time, given the complexity of the country's modern labor laws. Yet notwithstanding the strike's legality, on October 4th, when nearly 18,000 workers in Chile's coal industry walked off the job, Army regiments, Navy warships, and Air Force squadrons stormed into the coal towns, unleashing upon the miners and their families and neighbors the most severe repression ever before experienced in the region. Over the next days, military personnel ransacked union offices, political party headquarters, social and sports clubs, municipal halls, workers' homes, and even churches. By the end of February 1948, 5 months after the start of the strike, at least 7,000 people, including children, had been forcibly removed from their homes and banished from the region. At the same time, over 600 men and women were detained at the prison camp in the northern port town of Pisagua that I mentioned before, which was commanded in 1948 by a young army captain named Augusto Pinochet Ugarte. Indeed, Pinochet would later claim that it was his experiences in the late 1940s that first convinced him of the dangers of communism. Many previous strikes in Chile had been broken by force, but on few other occasions had the head of state ordered a full military assault on an entire region within the nation. This was a key moment in Chilean history when the Cold War exploded on the domestic scene with the violent quelling of a powerful regional workers' movement led by the Communist Party, but which had been pushing for more inclusive democracy and greater socioeconomic justice. What made this experience even more shocking for the working class men and women of the coal mines and around the country was that the man responsible for these acts, President Gabriel González Videla, was not a despotic enemy of democracy, nor an oppressor of the common people, but rather a man who had solicited their votes with tears in his eyes, to quote one of my interviewees, promising, quote, that under his government there would no longer be so much suffering. Indeed, one of the leading figures in González Videla's 1946 presidential campaign was none other than Communist Senator Pablo Neruda, who crisscrossed the country, passionately reciting poems he wrote, such as El pueblo lo llama Gabriel, the people call you Gabriel. Gabriel González Videla had come into the Chilean presidency as the standard bearer of an era of radical democratic promise, but he would leave office as the man who ushered in the exclusionary politics of the Cold War era. González Videla's administration was the third in a series of center-left governments in Chile that gained power beginning in the mid-1930s, in the global context of rising fascism and world war, when communists across Latin America responded to the call of the Moscow-led international, the Comintern, to form alliances with presumably progressive bourgeois or centrist middle-class parties. This new Popular Front strategy represented a move away from strident class warfare and toward an embrace of democracy. It was tied both to international anti-fascism and, in Chile, to nationalist plans for industrial growth developed in the midst of the Great Depression. While such center-left alliances or popular fronts were forged across Latin America, as I said, only in Chile did they succeed in winning the presidency. In 1938, an electoral coalition of socialists and communists with the centrist, non-Marxist Radical Party and other progressive groups successfully rallied behind the moderate Radical Party candidate Pedro Aguirre Cerda. Democracy and capitalism took on new social reform dimensions as Marxist parties and their working class followers bolstered their power within these existing systems rather than against them. The election of 3 consecutive radical presidents was no minor feat in Chile, as the executive had been controlled almost continuously by right-wing liberals and conservatives since Chile's consolidation as a sovereign nation state after 1830. The workers of the coal zone played a significant role in the dramatic story of this democratic coalition and its implosion, as not only were they a stronghold of support for the Chilean Communist Party, and in fact the region was often referred to as a red zone, but also when the global depression of the early 1930s shattered Chile's export-based economy, the nation embarked on a path of industrialization, for which coal was a fuel so vital that it was frequently referred to as black gold. Particularly during the war years, when imported coal became scarce, Chileans ardently discussed factors of productivity in the mines, politics in the region, and living conditions in the towns. This national attention, together with their high degree of organization, gave the miners an especially strong sense of empowerment as they moved to participate in the Popular Front coalition. When Gabriel González Videla, the third of the radical presidents elected with critical communist support, moved to quell the legal strike in the coal mining zone, citing it as a revolutionary move to cripple the Chilean economy, he put an end to what had promised to be one of the most progressive episodes of government in the Americas. Shortly after the assault on the coal mining region, González Videla secured passage of one of the most draconian internal state security laws in the Americas at the time. Formally directed against the Chilean Communist Party, the highly controversial 1948 Law for the Permanent Defense of Democracy disenfranchised nearly 40,000 voters nationwide. Largely from the working class, these men and women were not only removed from electoral registers, but were also barred from belonging to unions, going on strike, holding any public office, including as school teachers or union leaders, and enjoying other hard-won rights as workers and as citizens. Roughly 15% of the people on these blacklists hailed from the coal mining region. Dubbing this the damned law, actors across the political spectrum denounced this legislation as threatening to the very foundations of Chilean democracy. In the words of then socialist senator and future president Salvador Allende, the initiative of the executive was an atomic bomb dropped in the midst of our Republican principles, habits, and customs. On the floor of the Senate, González Videla also came under attack from his former campaign manager, communist Pablo Neruda, whom he accused of treasonous defamation and had stripped of his congressional immunity. After fleeing across the Andes to escape arrest, Neruda lambasted his former ally in every possible forum, including this 1949 pamphlet, González Videla, The Laval of Latin America, Brief Biography of a Traitor, which invoked the infamous Nazi collaborator of Vichy France, Pierre Laval. Unfortunately, the artist of this fabulous cover remains unknown to me. Neruda also devoted well over a quarter of his poetic masterwork, Canto General, to direct and indirect denunciations of González Videla, reviling him as a traitor, a Judas, a clown, a miserable mixture of monkey and rat whose tail is combed with a gold pomade on Wall Street. What had prompted González Videla and factions of the radical and socialist parties to turn so forcefully and relatively abruptly against their erstwhile allies? It wasn't just the political turn itself, which of course made sense in the global context, or even betrayal in the sense of palace intrigues that impressed me so much, but even more, the degree of repression unleashed in Chile in the late 1940s, especially in the coal mining region. Why was the coal mining zone militarily occupied for well over a year after the legal strike was broken? Why were hundreds of families forcibly removed from the zone in cattle cars? Why were municipal governments dismantled? And why was even fishing declared illegal? Many scholars of Chilean history have viewed the Popular Front era as a period of national political wrangling in which the interests of working class sectors were subsumed by a center-left political accommodation. But if the workers really had been manipulated into passivity, how then could I make sense of the ferocity with which progressive centrists turned against them? The extent and orientation of the repression, I found, could really only be understood by recognizing that a significant social movement based on popular notions of democratization and reform had been developing throughout the region in the previous decade. This challenges accounts of the Popular Front as a period of political negotiation in which leftist parties controlled and manipulated a passive worker base. And it also challenges accounts that emphasize the role of external forces, namely the United States and the Soviet Union, in driving the direction of Chilean history in the late 1940s. Rather, I found that González Videla's policy aimed not just to repress communists and labor leaders, but to unweave the entire social, political, and cultural fabric of the coal mining communities, which had come to symbolize a threat to existing hierarchies of power and distribution of resources. The coal miners did not, I don't believe, intend to overthrow the democratic government to install a communist dictatorship, as González Videla alleged. Rather, they were learning to use democratic forums to push for greater participation in public life, greater control in the workplace, and a greater share of the profits of their industry. Or, in other words, the sense of empowered identity and possibilities as citizen workers that I mentioned at the outset. In 1935, when the Chilean Popular Front was just taking shape, not only had the executive and Congress been historically dominated by right-wing parties, but so too had city councils, labor unions, and civil servant posts at all levels, including Labor Department officials who had the important charge of overseeing contract negotiations and adjudicating other worker-boss conflicts. But now, as communist and socialist parties embraced electoral democracy, many of their working class members throughout the country, and particularly in the coal mining region, swept into key positions. By the early 1940s, representatives of the Popular Front parties, especially the communists, held majorities on every major labor union and city council throughout the coal mining region. Former coal miners even reached the halls of the National Congress, as was the story of Damian Uribe Cárdenas, who in the late 1930s was chosen by his peers to be the union delegate for his small section of the Lota mines. He soon rose to the position of secretary in the powerful Lota Miners Union, a position he still held in 1941 when he was elected to the National Congress. Now, Uribe washed the coal dust from his face, put on a tie, and went to battle directly with conservative and liberal politicians, many of whom were major shareholders or top directors of the coal mining companies. Damian Uribe's story, to me, highlights changes in the ways class conflict played out under the Popular Front model. A communist coal miner from Lota, who a few years before was signing local union documents in a barely literate hand, was now able to directly represent his compañeros from the mines in the sphere of national politics. This takes our understanding of leftist politics in Chile beyond the dichotomy of reform versus revolution, and beyond the ideal or myth of continuous exceptional peace versus violence and dictatorship. Indeed, what the story of the coal miners in the 1930s and 40s shows most clearly is that democratic strivings and violent clashes between different social sectors have not been entirely at odds. Democracy, as it was embraced by Marxist parties and their working class followers in mid-20th century Chile, was an intrinsically contentious project. Mobilization from below came to be seen by workers not as a way to overthrow Chilean democracy or to halt its capitalist advance, but rather as a way to participate fully in it. Coal miner Damian Uribe was not revolutionary in the sense of violently or even non-violently taking control of the state, but his presence in the National Congress and the bold tenor of his speeches there speak to substantive shifts in social and political power that took place between 1935 and 1947. My findings in Mining for the Nation challenge a widely held notion of the passive character of the Popular Front years, revealing instead a complex decade of communist-led mobilization around a project of participatory political and social democracy. Thus, when Chile's centrist sectors moved away from the Communist Party and the working class and back into open coordination with right-wing forces in the late 1940s, they were responding not simply to international pressures at the start of the Cold War, but to assertions of popular protagonism developed over the preceding decade. Only the center-right perception of an empowered movement from below can explain the fury of domestic repression at the beginning of the Cold War. And this understanding helps us make sense of the ways popular sectors in Chile radicalized in the 1950s and 60s and through the popular unity government of the 1970s. While the U.S.-Soviet alliance at the height of the Second World War was certainly the immediate impetus for cooperation between centrist and leftist sectors, or between the progressive bourgeoisie and the working class, looking toward the end of the war, many left-leaning centrists in Chile hoped to continue friendly relations with the communists in order to shape a post-war world of peace and social justice. In the United States, this vision was shared by many people, especially those who supported the fullest development of New Deal socioeconomic policies. Indeed, one of the most fascinating actors to emerge during my research into the coal miner story was, as I mentioned at the outset, U.S. Vice President Henry Agard Wallace. I came to see that Wallace not only understood the radical democratizing potential of the coal miners' mobilization in these years and their support of the Communist Party, but he strongly promoted it. In early March 1943, speaking at Ohio Wesleyan University, Wallace declared, "The future well-being of the world depends upon the extent to which Marxianism, as it is being progressively modified in Russia, and democracy, as we are adapting it to 20th century conditions, can live together in peace." Just a few days after this talk in Ohio, where he pressed for deepening alliances with the Marxists, on March 16th, United States Vice President Henry Wallace embarked on a month-long goodwill tour of Latin America, to include stops in Costa Rica, Panama, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Chile. The first U.S. Vice President to visit South America, Wallace personally insisted that protocol arrangements be kept simple. And in lieu of lavish ceremonial gifts typically bestowed on such dignitaries, Wallace sent word ahead that he would most appreciate Latin American folk music recordings. After visiting several other countries, on March 26th, Wallace landed in Santiago de Chile, where, despite his request for simplicity, he was received with state honors. And as his car traveled from the airport, an estimated 100,000 people lined the streets, waving party banners and shouting "Down with fascism." In Santiago, the Vice President attended luncheons, dinners, military parades, and other events in his honor. On the floor of the National Congress, on the floor of the National Congress, he delivered a highly acclaimed speech in Spanish in which he declared that the revolutionary march of the people would bring about a post-war peace based on social justice in which Chile would have a distinguished place as a nation that showed the way. Though he graciously accepted the pomp and circumstance, Wallace was determined to visit Chile's farms, vineyards, ports, and the nitrate, copper, and coal mines so vital to the war effort. "I'm eager," he told reporters, "to meet and personally contact those associated with work production." After 4 days in the capital on March 30th, Wallace traveled by plane to Concepcion and then headed south by car to the coal mining town of Lota, where roughly 10,000 people turned out to greet him, many waving Communist Party and Labor Confederation flags. Many of the region's top communist leaders, including Congressman Damian Uribe, shared the stage with the illustrious U.S. Democrat, who again addressed the crowd in Spanish, hailing the coal miners as soldiers of democracy, just as vital and valiant as were those men in uniform fighting on the battlefields. Amid loud cheers, Wallace continued speaking to men who had come from long shifts of labor, women who had lost their husbands or fathers to explosions of methane gas, and to young boys who were already making the descent deep into the mines. Here, in the heart of Chile's coal region, Wallace declared this to be the century of the common people, not the century of international monopolies, nor of imperialist forces. In this century, Wallace proclaimed to the coal miners, "There will be no nation which will enjoy the divine power to exploit other nations." Again, the crowd went wild, committed, as was Wallace, both to victory over the fascists and to the national and global changes necessary for a just and lasting peace. Henry Wallace's March 1943 visit to the Chilean coal mines and throughout Latin America was, in the words of two of his biographers, an unqualified success in every way. The U.S. ambassador to Chile, Claude Bowers, whose invitation had prompted the Latin American tour, could not have been more pleased. As he wrote in a telegram to President Roosevelt, quote, "No such enthusiasm seen for any foreigner in Chilean history," adding that, quote, "support for President Hoover not approximating 10%. In a separate report, Bowers said, "The enthusiastic reaction of the common people cannot be explained away by press preparations, party orders, or anything else than the idea that here was a man representing the United States, fresh from Washington, who was their friend and deeply interested in their welfare." With tens of thousands of people turning out for all of Wallace's public appearances, and some as high as 80,000 or more, his popularity in Latin America would seem to have quite exceeded even that in his own native country. As early as the mid-1930s, Wallace had initiated an intense program of self-education on Latin America, reading widely in history and politics, mastering the Spanish language, and collecting Latin American folk music, which remained a favorite pastime throughout his life. Wallace's credibility among Latin American workers grew even further when, as chairman of the Board of Economic Welfare, the BEW, he pushed through mandatory labor clauses for all contracts with Latin American producers. These clauses were designed to ensure adequate wages and working conditions, even while maximizing productivity for war needs. As Wallace insisted on labor clauses, delivered his addresses in Spanish, and preached a Christian vision of justice with the common man at its heart, as he pronounced in his famous May 1942 speech, working-class men and women across Latin America came to view him as their most powerful global spokesman, whom they trusted and revered. Yet even as Wallace's prestige rose in the Southern Hemisphere, he was increasingly embattled at home. As President Roosevelt moved away from the New Deal causes of the 1930s, which he had championed so fervently, Wallace continued to promote a radical social agenda and never relented in seeking to keep alive the New Deal philosophy. As he made clear in many writings and speeches, such as that given at Ohio Wesleyan University just prior to his tour of Latin America, Wallace was also among the minority of politicians in the capitalist world who advocated ongoing East-West cooperation. Wallace was thus quite pleased with the Chilean communists' involvement in society and politics, and particularly the party's pursuit of broad democratic alliances. Part of the larger significance of Wallace's trip, I think, is that not merely did it revive flagging popular support for good neighborly Pan-Americanism, as it was intended to do, but it also cemented a relationship of trust and loose ideological affinity between Marxist and progressive sectors in Latin America and left-wing New Deal visionaries in the U.S. Thus, as the tides of World War II shifted and actors throughout the Western Hemisphere were debating possibilities for the post-war world, Wallace had become not only a stalwart New Dealer embattled in U.S. politics, but an influential, even iconic figure in a loose hemispheric community forged by shared visions of a post-war world that would prioritize progressive or redistributive socioeconomic policies, true North-South cooperation, and sustained center-left ideological and political projects. Chilean President Gabriel González Videla and U.S. Vice President Henry Agard Wallace both came through the 1930s and 40s as radical centrists who believed that global democracy and sustainable peace could only be built on a foundation of justice. Capitalism was in need of reform and constant vigilance, they argued, to ensure that working-class men and women were excluded neither from public participation nor from material benefits. And both men, at least through 1946, warned of the dangers of hardline anti-communism for world peace. Indeed, in 1946, as González Videla stood side by side with Pablo Neruda and other communists in his campaign for the presidency, then Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace was denouncing President Truman's mounting anti-Soviet position. And just about a week after González Videla's presidential victory, Wallace delivered what has been described as one of the most explosive speeches in American political history, his Way to Peace address on September 12th at Madison Square Garden, where he strongly indicted Truman policy. Ironically, on that very same day, U.S. Ambassador to Chile, Claude Bowers, sent a telegram to President Truman conveying President-elect González Videla's earnest wish that Henry Wallace be sent to represent the United States at his inauguration. González Videla argued that Wallace's presence was important to undercut the credibility of communist propaganda against the United States, since, quote, the Chilean masses would never believe that Wallace was either an imperialist or a reactionary. Heated controversy erupted as opponents of the appointment argued that it would signal that the United States gave a blessing to the extreme left that supported González Videla. The question of whether or not Truman would accede to a powerfully symbolic public meeting between González Videla and Wallace was answered by the fallout from the Way to Peace speech. On September 20th, President Truman asked Wallace to resign from the cabinet. To the presidential inauguration in Chile, Truman then sent Admiral William Leahy, his own chief of staff and coordinator of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yet as close as they were ideologically and strategically in the fall of 1946, by 1948, the positions of Henry Wallace and Gabriel González Videla had diverged dramatically. González Videla threw in his lot with U.S. hardliners, and the denunciation, Gabriel González de Truman, was graffitied on walls throughout the coal mining towns, then under military control. Wallace, on the other hand, made the difficult decision to break with the U.S. Democratic Party and run for the presidency on the Progressive Party ticket. In 1948, as González Videla was pushing through the law for the permanent defense of democracy against the communists, Wallace's campaign platform called for an end to the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which was investigating communist infiltration of labor unions and government agencies. And just as Allende and Neruda, Salvador Allende and Pablo Neruda denounced González Videla as anti-democratic, so too did Wallace and his supporters accuse the House Committee of violating basic civil liberties. Had Henry Wallace won the presidency, the Cold War as we know it would likely never have been waged, and González Videla's moves against the Chilean communists, had he made them, would have been internationally rebuked. Though in the end he garnered only 2.4% of the vote, Henry Wallace's story shows alternative paths opened to González Videla. Even as some international forces were pushing to escalate the U.S.-Soviet conflict, Wallace and his followers remained committed to the ideal of global peace based on socioeconomic justice. González Videla's moves in 1947-48 were not historically inevitable, and they brought Chilean democracy to the brink of crisis, not for the first time, but now in a particular fashion that would mark the rest of the 20th century, a crisis over the expansion of citizenship and redefinitions of democracy, followed by a brutal contraction of the polity and mass exclusion. Henry Wallace, indeed, became one of the U.S. historical figures most singularly beloved by Latin American popular sectors. Yet, what I found is that he is one among many U.S. actors who greatly influenced progressive movements and discourses in mid-20th century Latin America, and who also drew significant inspiration, ideas, and support from them. My work on Wallace, which I've shared just a little bit about this evening, is part of a larger new research project currently titled New Deal Visions for the Post-War Americas, Transnational Links Between U.S. and Latin American Progressives in the 1930s to the 1950s. And I hope to be able to come back in a few years and share more with you about how this new project has taken shape. So for now, thank you very much for coming out.
Jody, does anybody have a question or two, or something that you'd like to pose to her? She's enlightened us with all this interesting intrigue that went on. Anybody at all? Yes.
Let's see, how can I word like this? It's difficult to articulate like the question. I'm still digesting everything that you said. But maybe one of the part of the sentence that, you know, the way that you articulated like the title of your next book, I was, you know, wondering with the obvious comparison with the Argentinian case and the Argentinian history, in which the Communist Party had also been like pretty active before the 1930 revolution of Uriburu, but had kind of failed to approach the masses. That was only possible with Perón's advent in the mid-1940s. So I was wondering if, and I think that it remains in Argentina ever since, like kind of like an opening, like a bridge between like the official Communist Party and the populism that was inaugurated by Peronismo. So I don't know if you have like, you know, started like thinking about this, of what like this relationship of this influence or the impact of the figure of Wallace in the Southern Cone, or, you know, Latin America. I think that you are not talking about Central America, right, which is a completely different story. But maybe in the Southern Cone, what the impact was within the Argentinian.
You know, that's funny, Maria, because your question at one point was hearkening me back to my doctoral comprehensive exams, where one of my advisors asked me if I thought the Popular Front was populist. And so I of course, have engaged. What? The Frente Popular in Chile. The electoral coalition that I've been referring to, in what sense this was akin to populism going on elsewhere. You know, did Chile experience populism? So I think it's an interesting question. You know, Argentina is one of the countries, you know, that I've studied quite a bit. I haven't fit it into this particular project, and in fact, the countries that I'm looking at right now are Chile, Bolivia, and Mexico as the sort of first countries that I'm incorporating into this for a variety of reasons, given their Communist Party. I mean, the history of the Argentine Communist Party is so unique in Latin America because of the Peronist phenomena and the positions that the party took vis-a-vis Peronism. So it doesn't fit, I don't think, very easily into a hemispheric movement. So I think that Argentina is an outlier in many ways in this, and the Communist Party in particular. I mean, the Communist Party, by the time you're getting to the late 1940s, the Communist Party is virtually crushed. I mean, it's, you know, very small and being driven out of the labor unions. So, you know, as the strength of the Communist Party in Chile is rising, the strength of the Communist Party in Argentina has declined so much. So I'm actually trying to look at places where the Communist parties have a similar growth in strength in this period and participation in the democratic governance of the country. So I think Argentina is a quite different history.
Do you happen to know what reaction that the United States had to the 1952 revolution in Bolivia? What was the...
In what sense?
Well, if it kind of supported like the revolution, or they tried to take a distance or saw it like a symptom of, of a very dangerous.
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I teach in my revolutions class, we do a comparison between the U.S. response to the 1952 revolution in Bolivia and the U.S. response to the democratic spring in Guatemala in 1954. In 1952, there was actually a revolution. By force, workers took over the state. They were, you know, largely Marxist forces in the revolutionary group. In Guatemala, you had a democratic government elected to office, and the United States intervened forcefully to overthrow that government. So it's a very interesting juxtaposition of those two cases. In Bolivia, we used dollar diplomacy, negotiations, and over the ensuing years, basically you know, got the MNR, got the revolutionary government to back off the most radical redistributive aspects of their revolution. So, I mean, it was, you know, it's talked about as a co-opted revolution as opposed to being overthrown. And there's lots of different explanations that people look out for why the difference. I mean, one of them is that Bolivia's main resource is tin, and they were dependent upon U.S. refineries to process that tin. So there was a bargaining chip that the United States clearly had in the case of Bolivia that we didn't have with Guatemala. And then, of course, there's the involvement of the Dulles brothers and all of that in the Guatemalan case. So, yeah.
Anybody else? Yeah, right over here.
Hi. Why, after Wallace's forced resignation, do you think that the Chilean government chose to take such a submissive role to the U.S.'s views on labor organization rather than a more like adversarial role? Like, why do you think that they were so submissive in that situation?
Well, first of all, I mean, Wallace's resignation came after González Videla's turn. So I don't think it was a direct response to it. I mean, certainly, and I don't mean, and you know, in the book, I do not anywhere state or mean to imply that there was not Cold War pressure on the United States government to break with, on the Chilean government to break with the communists. The State Department documents are filled with it. There was huge pressure on González Videla to conform, to fall in line with the new Cold War political alignments. So I don't want to say that there were not significant international pressures that, you know, most Latin American countries as dependent economies to the United States fell in line with. But what I do try to show in my work was that that is not, while they're important factors, that's not a sufficient explanation. Had González Videla wanted to fall in line with the United States, take a submissive position, he could have done so in a far less ferocious, complete, deep way. So that reaction that happens among the center, I really think has to do with the development of this popular movement where the radicals had maintained control basically over the political process up until about the early 1940s, and they started to lose control. And by the time you get to the end of the war, the communists, during the war years, the communists had asked their working class cadres to abide by no strike pledges, to increase productivity, to do all of these things for the war effort. And the working classes, for the most part, loyal to the communists, had done so. With the end of the war, communists throughout Latin America started taking a harder position. And González Videla represented the man who was going to actually fulfill the promises of the Popular Front years, the reform promises, the actual structural changes that this political configuration had promised, but not really carried through. So in the late 1940s, mid-late 1940s, I think there was a confluence both of the mobilized, communist-led working class movement really asserting itself and saying, now we're going to push through these things, and the center saying, this is more than we bargained for. This is not what we wanted. This needs to be put down. So, I mean, I do think that the international factors were at play, but I don't think they were determinant of how the break took place. Jeff.
One more and then we'll break. And let me just, before we go to that, there are some refreshments over there, so before you leave, grab some of those. Now it's yours.
Thanks. I was struck by a couple of the terms that you used to describe to some of your political actors. I mean, one being communists who are small d Democrats, and another term you used, which I found interesting, was radical centrists. And what it makes me think is that some of your political actors weren't fitting into established political paradigms. And you alluded to that in your talk, which makes me wonder, I mean, to what extent was the ability of the Chilean government to suppress them based solely upon force, which clearly was based upon force, but was it also a case that the coal miners and the labor union leaders weren't able to articulate a clear political identity or a clear political program to compete with the dichotomy that you laid out in your talk? I mean, I guess my question is, I mean, were they able to? I mean, did they offer a clear political program that in fact was an alternative to existing political paradigms, or was it in part sort of a failure of ideology in addition to the force used by government, if that makes sense?
Yeah, you know, Jeff, I think that's a very interesting observation, and it's helpful to me to think about that in terms of the project, because going back to what I was saying to Mike, Pablo Neruda, for example, is a communist. He is a Democrat. I mean, Pablo Neruda, these are communists who deeply believe in democratic process, and they, so in that way, I don't think they're out of step during the Popular Front years, but when, with the end of the war, international communism starts moving towards a harder line and away from this alliance, I think it's quite possible that this group of actors that I'm looking at are out of step with the direction that the party's going in. So I'm not sure in Chile, yeah, I'll have to think about it more. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure in Chile, you know, starting in 1946 when González Videla is elected, I mean, they have a very clear platform. The González Videla campaign has a clear platform. However, González Videla brings 3 communists into his cabinet in 1946 for the first time anywhere in the Americas. He makes a communist the Secretary of Labor, a communist the Secretary of Agriculture, and a communist the Secretary of Public Works. He also has right-wing liberals in his cabinet. It is a very, it's a very sui generis political moment where you have communists who have embraced democracy and right-wing liberals in this same cabinet. So in that sense, that's not a viable vision, and it wasn't a viable vision, and so, yeah.
Interesting. Maybe that's a good note. Anyway, refreshments over there, but thanks very much, Jody. Very much.